We're going to continue looking at the causes of the United States Civil War. We left off with discussing the main differences between the North and the South and how those led to tension. We then looked at failed compromises, beginning with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Each of these led the nation further into crisis because they each produced tension between the two sides, the North and South, with differences that could not be resolved as time went on. We're going to start today with a discussion of slavery, because that was a huge institution that played into all of this tension between the North and the South. We know that the South relied on a rural agricultural society. Slavery was a big part of that. Slave labor enabled Southern plantation owners and farmers to reap huge profits in the South. So therefore, it was in their best interest to keep slaves. However, as the country continued to grow and become different, the question of slavery was one that could not be resolved peacefully. If you look on the right hand of your screen, there are some questions to think about when it comes to slavery. Number 1, what were the organization and functions of the Underground Railroad? Number 2, who were Harriet Tubman and Harriet Beecher Stowe? Number 3, what violence erupted in Kansas over slavery and in Congress between Senator Charles Sumner and Representative Preston Brooks? Question number 3 is something that was referred to in the previous video when we discussed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What you need to do with these questions is to try to answer them using pages 158 through 161 in your textbook. Answer these questions on a piece of paper and be ready to discuss them in class. Let's take a look at two ladies who played a huge part in the protest to slavery. The first is Harriet Tubman, who many of you have heard of before. She was a famous conductor on what was known as the Underground Railroad, which was a series of tunnels, trails, and other places that slaves used to escape from the South to the North. Conductors were individuals who would lead escaped slaves from their plantations or farms to freedom. This was a very dangerous journey because being caught meant not only the return to the plantation or the farm, but usually a very severe beating as well. Or it could end up in execution for the escaped slave. Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave herself. She was able to lead over 300 people to freedom in the course of her life. In doing so, she became an advocate for the abolishment of slavery. Many anti-slavery advocates in the North viewed Harriet Tubman as a leader of their cause because she herself had been an escaped slave and knew what that lifestyle was like. She also showed great determination and bravery in leading these 300 plus people to freedom. She made over 19 trips in her lifetime, which became even more dangerous when the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted as a part of the Compromise of 1850, which we discussed in the last recording. Therefore, Harriet risked her life every time she made one of these trips back to the South to retrieve more slaves to help to freedom. Many plantation owners in the South and farm owners viewed Harriet Tubman as a severe threat to their way of life. There was a bounty out on her head, which shows you how much of a resistance they put up to try to capture her. Another individual who was key in trying to lead the movement to end slavery was a lady by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her father had been a minister during the Second Great Awakening. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an anti-slavery activist. She wrote a very famous book which brought the horrors of slavery into the homes of many Americans, who, for many of them, the first time seeing the detail of what slaves had to live through. Her information came from interviews that she conducted with escaped slaves who had made it to the North. Her book was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it stressed that slavery was not just a political contest, but a great moral struggle as well. The book was fiction, but the characters in the book portrayed Southern plantation owners to be horrible monsters which would beat their slaves or kill them. They treated them like property and nothing more. Harriet Beecher Stowe made her book as graphic as possible because not only had she conducted interviews with escaped slaves, but as a child she had watched many boats filled with people on their way to be sold at slave markets, and that left a deep impression on her. The book itself had two major effects. In the North, it stirred many abolitionists or anti-slavery activists to try to take more action to end slavery and to step up their protests, especially to the Fugitive Slave Act. However, as you can imagine, in the South, the book was criticized as an attack on the South. Just like Harriet Tubman, there was a bounty out for Harriet Beecher Stowe's head as well. Because of these two women, the tension between the North and South increased further. Let's review again the issue with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We had said before in the previous recording, with the Compromise of 1850 and prior to that, the Missouri Compromise, new territory added to the United States was supposed to be decided as far as whether it was going to be free or slave territory. With the Missouri Compromise of 1820, it had been decided that there would be a boundary line which would separate free states from slave states, and any new territories applying for statehood would be determined based on that boundary line. The Compromise of 1850 changed that when all of that territory was won from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. In two territories, New Mexico and Utah, popular sovereignty was allowed, where the people could decide whether they wanted slavery or not. A senator named Stephen Douglas felt that popular sovereignty was the best way to decide whether slavery should be allowed in any territory, especially the Nebraska Territory, which sat north of Oklahoma and to the west of Missouri and Iowa. This territory was huge. The only difficulty was that, unlike the New Mexico and Utah territories, the Kansas and Nebraska Territory was north of the Missouri Compromise line, and so therefore slavery should not have been allowed according to that boundary that had been created way back in 1820. But Stephen Douglas introduced a bill to Congress in 1854 that would divide up the territory of Kansas into two, Nebraska and Kansas. If this bill passed, the bill would basically get rid of the Missouri Compromise and say that popular sovereignty would now determine whether slavery would be allowed in any new territory. There was a lot of debate in Congress about this. Obviously, the northern congressmen saw this bill as a plot to take away free labor and replace it with slave labor. Southerners thought that this was a good idea because people could vote for slavery if they wanted to, even if they lived in a territory that was above that boundary line. After months of a long struggle, the Kansas-Nebraska Act became a law in 1854. But it was a very heated contest. When the territory of Kansas voted whether or not they were going to be slave or free, there was a lot of illegal voting that took place. Both supporters and opponents of slavery wanted to move into Kansas in order to win the vote on slavery for that territory. By March of 1855, Kansas had enough settlers to hold an election for a territorial legislature or a government for that territory that could make laws. But thousands of what was called border ruffians from the slave state of Missouri crossed over illegally into Kansas and voted. And because of that, they won fraudulently the majority of the pro-slavery candidates for the new legislature. So therefore, a new government was set up for the territory, and they went about issuing a series of pro-slavery acts. Obviously, many abolitionists or anti-slavery activists were furious about this because they knew that the vote was illegal to begin with. Many violent acts broke out, and so therefore Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas. This violence even spilled over into our Congress. I mentioned before in the last video that there were two men involved in a beating right in the floors of the Congress Hall. In May of 1855, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech in the Senate, and it was called The Crime Against Kansas. And for 2 days, he basically verbally assaulted the South and their way of life and slavery, and he singled out in his speech a senator from South Carolina named Andrew Butler. Well, Butler's nephew, who was a congressman named Preston Brooks, heard about this speech. He walked into the Senate chamber and struck Senator Charles Sumner on the head repeatedly with a cane. He put Charles Sumner into a coma, and he suffered brain damage. It took him more than 3 years to return to the Senate and be able to do his job. This violence right in our own Congress between people who were supposed to act civilly showed how much tension there was between the North and the South, and the fact that they could not resolve their differences peacefully. As the two regions grew further apart, the old national parties ruptured and new political parties formed. Here's some more questions to think about that I would like for you to try to answer using pages 161 up to 162. Number 1, how did slavery affect the Whig and Know Nothing parties? And what issue united the Republican Party? The 1840s and 1850s saw the emergence of new political parties and the breaking apart of old political parties. The Whig Party had existed since the early 1800s, but because of the growing differences between North and South, they weren't able to agree on a single set of beliefs for the entire nation. People from the North and South disagreed on things like slavery. So therefore, the Whig Party could not hold itself together and it died out. An alternative party that formed was called the American Party, and they were nicknamed the Know Nothings. And the major emphasis for this party was to get rid of immigrants. They weren't too big on slavery. They could not really agree on what their position was. Their main thing was immigration. They did not want new people coming into the country. They kind of split apart too, because at that time, that wasn't the big issue in our country. It was the growing differences between North and South. So a new party formed called the Free Soilers, and these were people, as you can imagine, who were against slavery. That's why their name was Free Soil. It wasn't necessarily that they loved slaves and wanted to help them. They were against slavery because it would interfere with their ability to get jobs. If all the slaves were set free, then there would be job competition. So basically, they were fine with slavery existing where it already did. They just didn't want slavery to expand into the new territories because that would lessen their chance of getting a job in some of these new territories. So it's important to remember that Free Soilers were not abolitionists. They were simply people who did not want slavery to expand into the West, so that they did not have to deal with job competition. Finally, the new Republican Party came out in 1854. Mostly these were made up of people who didn't want slavery to expand west, but they also included abolitionists. These people were against the Kansas-Nebraska Act with popular sovereignty because they felt like it violated the previous Missouri Compromise. Finally, there was a court case, a raid, and a new president elected, which brought the country to the brink of civil war. The last 4 questions to think about are on your screen. Number 1, what was the Dred Scott decision and why is it so important to the slavery conflict? Number 2, what was the disagreement between Lincoln and Douglas? Number 3, what happened at Harper's Ferry? And finally, how did Lincoln's election result in secession? The answers to these questions can be found from pages 162 to 165. Let's look at the Dred Scott case. If you look on page 166 of your book, you'll see a better description of the court case and how it started, what the ruling was, and the reasoning behind the ruling. But basically, Dred Scott was a man who had lived as a slave in the slave state of Missouri. However, he was taken to the slave state of Missouri to a free territory in Illinois and Wisconsin, and then back to Missouri. So basically, he sued, saying that since he had lived in a free territory at one point, he should not be a slave. The case was in court for a number of years, but basically the decision in 1857 was that Dred Scott lacked any legal standing to sue in a court because pretty much he wasn't even viewed as a citizen or even a person. He was considered property, so he never had any right to sue in the first place. You can imagine that this court case excited Southerners because now they saw the Supreme Court as agreeing with them and outraging Northerners. The Northerners were mad that the majority of the Supreme Court were people who were from the South. The South, on the other hand, were extremely excited because to them, this decision not only allowed for slavery to expand, but pretty much guaranteed it. So they were happy with this decision. But finally, the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the election of Abraham Lincoln made the country unable to resolve its differences any longer.